MDA's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been extensive, including supporting several pieces of legislation on Capitol Hill that were intended to drive our nation's public health and economic response. We also work with federal regulatory agencies such as the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services on ensuring quality health coverage during the public health emergency, as well as the FDA on the development, authorization, and approval of medical products. Today's webinar continues our efforts to serve the neuromuscular disease community during the pandemic. This is our second Advocacy Institute webinar, and today we are bringing the FDA experts to you, the neuromuscular disease community. We got lots of amazing questions from folks across the community, and unfortunately we can't get to all of them today. But all of your questions are incredibly important, and we will look for ways to work with FDA to answer the questions we couldn't get to today. All right, so this webinar is being recorded, so if you don't catch everything our FDA experts are saying, we will be posting the recording shortly on our web pages, on Twitter, our other social media pages, and elsewhere for viewing later on. We are so incredibly grateful to our 5 FDA experts who took the time out of their very busy schedules responding to the public health emergency to join us today. So, without further ado, some introductions. First, we have Dr. Eric Bastings. Dr. Bastings is the Acting Deputy Director of the Office of Neuroscience and the Acting Director of the Division of Neurology 1 at FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. In this role, Dr. Bastings helps oversee the regulation and review of drug and biologic products for the treatment of a variety of neurological conditions, including muscular dystrophies, ALS, and other neuromuscular diseases. We're also very grateful that Dr. Teresa Baracchio can join us today. Dr. Baracchio is the Acting Deputy Director for the Division of Neurology 1 and is a neurologist with subspecialty training in geriatric neurology. She joined the Division of Neurology Products in 2014, where she has worked as a clinical reviewer and team leader for several disease areas, including neuromuscular and rare diseases. We're very grateful that Dr. Emily Thacker can join us today. Dr. Thacker is a team leader with the drug shortage staff at the FDA. She joined FDA in 1999 as a consumer safety officer for the regulatory support branch in the Office of Generic Drugs. She then joined the Office of Regulatory Policy and has been in her current position with the drug shortage staff since February 2011. We're grateful that Dr. John Concato can join us. Dr. Concato is the Deputy Director of the Office of Medical Policy Initiatives in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Dr. Concato works to develop, coordinate, and implement medical policy programs and strategic initiatives to support and improve medical product development and post-marketing processes, including in emerging areas such as the use of real-world evidence as well as clinical trial conduct during the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the topics for today. But before turning over to our panelists, I want to first introduce and welcome Dr. Anand Shah, Deputy Commissioner for Medical and Scientific Affairs. Dr. Shah is responsible for developing and leading high-priority FDA policy initiatives and oversees cross-agency teams in support of FDA's public health mission. Dr. Shah, I turn it over to you.
Paul, I want to thank you for inviting us to today's webinar and giving us this opportunity to discuss FDA's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and more specifically the impact on the neuromuscular disease community. It's essential that we balance our benefits to develop safe and effective treatments and vaccines for COVID-19 during this public health emergency with the FDA's many other priorities for protecting public health, including helping to bring safe and effective treatments to patients with rare diseases as soon as possible. We look forward to discussing these issues with you today. The primary purpose of this session is to get your input and respond to the questions that we've received from MDA. To help do that, Paul, as you mentioned, we're joined today by a number of my colleagues at FDA, our expert scientists, 2 from our Office of New Drugs, Neurology Division, Drs. Eric Bastings and Teresa Baracchio, Commander Emily Thakur from the Drug Shortages staff, and Dr. John Concato of the Office of Medical Policy. And please know that we've also consulted with experts in our Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, as well in preparing for this webinar. But before we turn to my expert colleagues, I want to offer a few comments about FDA's work responding to the pandemic. As we are all very well aware, it's been an extraordinary time for the nation and the world. A crisis of this unprecedented magnitude requires all of us joining together to find answers. So I want to thank many of you on today's call for your commitment and hard work during this challenging time. At FDA, our staff has been working around the clock to support and collaborate with other government agencies in the private sector, doctors, nurses, other healthcare professionals, as well as scientists, researchers, and device and drug developers. Our agency has taken different responsibilities during a public health emergency such as this one, but one aspect of our work is to maintain a focus on the needs of high-risk communities and those with particular vulnerabilities. A key area of our work has been in the facilitation of increases in our national testing capacity around COVID-19. As all of you know, there's been a special emphasis on the development and availability of accurate and reliable tests, both diagnostic and serological. Quite simply, we need to know who has the disease and who's had it. And really, this is essential if we're going to understand this virus and return to a more normal lifestyle. Since January, we've worked with hundreds of test developers, many of whom have submitted emergency use authorization requests to the agency for tests that detect the virus and its antibodies. And today, there are multiple reliable tests on the market, and we are constantly authorizing new ones with updated data and evidence. We're also focused on the development of treatments and vaccines. As you know, since this novel coronavirus has appeared, the learning curve has been steep. Our goal from the very beginning has been to use every available tool to support the development of new treatments and to get them to patients as quickly as possible. To do this, we've embraced the full extent of our regulatory flexibility and adopted new approaches that have allowed us to deliver very rapid advice and review. We've streamlined processes and operations for developers and scientists to send in inquiries and requests, and we provide support and guidance for healthcare providers and researchers who submit emergency requests to use investigational products for individual patients. We're working closely with drug manufacturers and have provided advice and guidance, technical assistance to expedite clinical trial. And this includes both support for clinical trials for COVID-19 treatments and vaccines, and also for sponsors that were conducting clinical trials when COVID-19 struck. And this was intended to help ensure that any logistical and operational challenges resulting from COVID-19 could be addressed and the clinical trial could be continued. We're very well aware of the importance of maintaining participation in these trials, both for sponsors and most importantly for the patients to keep them on their regimen. But it's got to be done in a way that protects their safety. And we continue to act speedily on requests from sponsors and scientists seeking to develop new drug and biologic therapies. I want to point out that while our goal during this emergency has been to speed the development and availability of potentially safe and effective life-saving treatments, we do so while maintaining the FDA's commitment to good science and data. Expediting development is important, but it is also critical, especially during an emergency of this scale, that we do everything we can to help ensure the safety and effectiveness of these products. As Commissioner Hahn often says, the search for new products is an ongoing process that relies on research and data to continually evaluate and reevaluate whether such products are safe and effective through a careful, necessary balancing of risk and benefits. And although we have a long way to go, there are promising signals. A variety of therapeutic areas are being evaluated for COVID-19 patients, including antiviral drugs and immunotherapies that may be helpful in reducing lung inflammation and improving lung function. We're working with many different drug manufacturers, and we've provided guidance and technical assistance to expedite clinical trials for different products. There are currently more than 144 clinical trials of drugs and biologics that are proceeding. We're also continuing to facilitate vaccine development. This is an important and exciting area, which ultimately may be the way that we defeat this disease. And as we work towards this goal of safe and effective vaccines, the FDA is providing regulatory advice, guidance, technical assistance to advance development and availability. As you may know, there are several experimental designs that are currently under consideration. Again, we're working with a number of vaccine sponsors, including 4 sponsors who have announced that they have vaccine candidates that are now in clinical trials in the US. Another very important area that we've been focused on is working to ensure continued access to necessary medical products, including drugs and medical devices, such as ventilators, hand sanitizer, and personal protective equipment, or PPE. We continue to closely monitor the global supply chain to identify concerns and address the availability of products that Americans need most. We're looking for potential disruptions to supply or shortages of critical medical products in the country. And as part of our effort to identify potential disruptions or shortages, we've been reaching out to manufacturers. And if and one is identified, we're using every available tool to react swiftly and mitigate the impact to American patients and healthcare professionals. I know that this is one area of particular importance for this community huddled today on the webinar. I want to ensure you that we're doing everything we can to ensure that the impact on the supply of important therapies for patients with rare diseases is not interrupted, including increased flexibility for sponsors of home monitoring equipment. There are a number of other issues that we're working on that specifically affect the MDA community. And as I mentioned at the onset, a focus of our work is to support the best ideas and innovations so that we can facilitate the development of new, safe and effective drugs and biological products and get the necessary medicines to desperately sick patients as quickly as possible. This is particularly important as it involves the rare disease community generally, including the MDA community. As you all know too well, patients with certain underlying conditions are at a risk of more severe illness from COVID-19, and the impact on patients, including those with neuromuscular diseases and their families, can be profound. COVID-19 not only can cause increased risk for patients with underlying conditions, it can also lead to interruptions in care through cancellation of medical appointments, disruptions in clinical trials, as well as loss of job and related to this, loss of health insurance. A recent study revealed that 95% of people with a rare disease have been impacted to some degree by COVID at a cost to their immediate and long-term health and well-being. These issues and our efforts related to sponsors' development of new drugs and biological products to treat rare diseases remains a priority for the agency, even as we continue to respond to COVID-19. We're looking to learn from and apply more broadly some of the approaches that we've taken during the pandemic, which may prove beneficial in the FDA's work in other areas. For example, we recognize that the pandemic has had an impact on clinical trials of products not related directly to COVID-19, and we've been working to mitigate any effects, and we've issued a guidance to provide greater clarity to sponsors about how to proceed with these trials and deal with necessary deviations in the conduct created by the pandemic. The agency's expanded access program has for many years helped facilitate access to promising therapies and investigational products for patients with life-threatening rare diseases, while clinical trials on these products are still underway. And although it's ultimately the decision of the sponsor or manufacturer whether to provide a product under expanded access, we at the agency help to facilitate access to these products via this mechanism for patients who are unable to participate in clinical trials. Our goal has always been to exercise appropriate regulatory flexibility in applying the statutory standards to medical products for serious diseases with unmet medical needs, including neuromuscular diseases. And as the COVID-19 emergency continues and FDA works to help facilitate the development of products to control this outbreak, we remain steadfast in our commitment to all patients and to expedite the review and approval of products for serious conditions and life-threatening diseases where there is a tremendous unmet need. It's especially important that we don't allow the current public health crisis to deter the scientific progress that we've seen in recent years that has created such great promise in the development of products to treat many previously untreatable rare diseases. We truly appreciate our relationship with the MDA community, and we look forward to continued advancement of the critical programs that support treatments for patients with neuromuscular disease. Thank you again, Paul. We are honored to join together with the community, and now I'll turn it over to my colleagues to address your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shah. We're very grateful for your time, for your expertise, for your message. We're very grateful for your presence today on our on our webinar with the neuromuscular disease community. You touched on a lot of areas, including a lot of the areas that our community wrote in with questions for our FDA experts. And so we wanted to get started on the area of drug shortages, an area that you mentioned, Dr. Shah. And our first question is going to go to Dr. Emily Thacker of the drug shortages team. We had a question from Cindy, a member of the community. She asked specifically about drug shortages for the treatments tramadol and baclofen. But I want to actually open the question up a bit further to you, Dr. Thacker, and to ask, how does FDA monitor, perhaps even predict, shortages of essential medicines? And hypothetically speaking, if there was to be a shortage of a medicine like those mentioned by Cindy, how would Cindy find out? How would FDA work to ensure that Cindy got her necessary medicines? Dr. Thacker?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for having us here this afternoon. Fortunately, currently there are no shortages of either tramadol or baclofen. However, drug shortages, we know, pose a significant public health threat that can delay critical needed care for patients for many drugs. FDA actively works with manufacturers and other U.S. federal agencies to try to address supply issues for drug products in or at risk of shortage. FDA determines how best to address each shortage situation based on the cause and the public health risk associated with that shortage. So while FDA works to find ways to prevent and mitigate drug shortages, there are multiple factors that can cause or contribute to drug shortages that are sometimes outside of FDA's control. FDA cannot require a pharmaceutical company to make a drug or make more of a drug, even if it is a medically necessary product. We will continue to do all we can within our authorities to prevent and mitigate shortages. We continue to work with industry and other partners to help ensure that product remains available to meet the needs of our patients. The most recent information about drugs that are determined to be in shortage is available on FDA's CDER's drug shortage website. I believe we can give you that link if you don't have it already. And that website is updated daily. So that's how Cindy and other patients and folks can get updated information on their products.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thacker. And we'll be sure to include that link in follow-up materials and in other ways so folks can find their way to that page and check to see if there are indeed any shortages in their area that they need to be aware of. I'd like to turn our attention over to, yes, thank you. I'd like to turn our attention over to clinical trials, as I know that clinical trials, of course, provide hope for many in the neuromuscular disease community for a safe and effective therapy. And we received many questions on the topic of clinical trials. So one of the first questions that we received is from Mark, and Mark asked, how has COVID-19 affected neuromuscular disease clinical trials? Are they on hold? And I'd like to add on to what Mark asked, to ask, what is FDA observing on the status of neuromuscular disease clinical trials during the COVID-19 outbreak? Dr. Concado, I'll turn this one over to you.
Thank you for the question, Paul, and I'm honored to be participating in the webinar today. In addressing that question, we must start out by acknowledging that, as we know, the COVID-19 public health emergency can impact the status of clinical trials, including in neuromuscular disease, because of challenges such as site closures, travel limitations, isolation practices, even interruptions in supplying the investigational products. But it's clear, as Dr. Shah's comments indicated, that FDA is working on a daily basis with companies, with hospitals, with academic centers and investigators to understand and address the challenges that may disrupt the trial. And first and foremost is patient safety as the primary concern. So we must say that, for example, depending on the circumstances of a trial, it may sometimes be in the best interest of safety for certain patients to stop taking the study drug, or even potentially to be removed from a trial. We hope that doesn't happen often, but such situations will depend on the type of product under investigation, the ability to monitor patient safety appropriately, the ability to get the product through the supply chain, and the nature of the condition being studied. So each case is different. More generally and more optimistically, to help both sponsors conducting trials during the public health emergency as well as patients, FDA has published, among other guidances, a document titled The Conduct of Clinical Trials of Medical Products During the COVID-19 Public Health Emergency. As the title suggests, and again, as Dr. Shah had alluded to, this guidance is intended specifically to help with the process of clinical trials during these unprecedented times. The guidance has been updated several times in keeping with new information and new questions from the field, and it currently has 23 question and answers in an appendix, which we hope constitutes a user-friendly part of an overall useful guidance. As an overview, the guidance talks about potential ways to conduct certain aspects of clinical trials that both help assure the safety of participants, but while also protecting the quality and the integrity of data, which will eventually come to the FDA via submission. So, for example, the guidance mentions potentially conducting certain assessments, such as patient-reported outcomes, remotely, rather than in person at a clinical trial site, even if that's the way the trial was first designed. The guidance also discusses potentially conducting certain laboratory and imaging assessments at local facilities instead of a trial site if, say, a participant can't make it to the trial site, such as when public health measures might limit travel or the other challenges that we've talked about. And as a specific point, we just want to emphasize that FDA recognizes that any decision to change or potentially even stop a trial for a period of time does raise the risk of preventing patients from receiving an investigational drug. But in certain cases, it is possible to ship the medication to the patient's home if, for example, the drug is normally taken at home. And even for investigational products that, say, are delivered intravenously, the guidance recommends that certain alternative options be considered if, for example, an appropriate risk assessment determines that it's doing so is safe for patients. So we're really trying to, as Dr. Shah mentioned, work within our regulations, exercise appropriate flexibility, and allow these trials to continue. And an important part, besides the guidance, is that FDA review divisions, including those in the Office of Neuroscience, are working on a daily basis with sponsors to make appropriate changes to clinical trials that both protect patient safety and also allow for the collection of data, as I mentioned, that could be used by FDA later to assess the effectiveness and safety of an investigational product and keep the drug development process moving along. Finally, I'll mention that FDA is aware from stakeholders that some trials have paused enrollment, but actually the agency does not receive data from those sponsors about the impact of all trials. And specifically as well, a temporary pause in trial enrollment doesn't necessarily need to be reported to the FDA if no patient safety issues arise related to that pause, but we are in constant communication with sponsors. In addition, I should add that disclosure laws limit our ability to comment on the status of any specific trial, including any particular neuromuscular disease trial that you may be involved with or interested about. And unfortunately, again, we're limited in our ability to talk about that. But I would say more generally, if you're a patient participating in a clinical trial, the agency recommends that you speak first and foremost with staff at your clinical trial site about any changes to the trial that may be planned. And you can even ask if they're in communication with the FDA, because I'll take advantage of this opportunity to mention that for general questions, whether it's from a sponsor, an investigator, or a patient, we do have a new mailbox dedicated to clinical trial conduct during this public health emergency. I could read the address. I'll say it out loud, not expecting anyone to remember it, but it's clinical trial conduct -COVID-19 at fda.hhs.gov. As Emily said, we'll make sure all of these links and addresses are available after the webinar, but we wanted to make sure that it's clear how available the FDA is to help in this regard. So forgive me if my answer was a bit long, but it's a very important question, and I hope the details give a sense of the efforts being made by the FDA to support clinical trials during COVID. with that, I'll turn it back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Concato. And we're going to stay on the topic of clinical trials with actually a related question. And this comes from Erin at one of our patient advocacy group partners, Cure Duchenne. Thanks for the question, Erin. She asks, what virtual and remote data collection and assessment tools do you see remaining viable and reliable post-COVID-19? And let me add on to that question as well. Many clinical trials are employing virtual remote data collection and assessment tools to continue during the pandemic. How does the FDA envision that these tools can be continued to be used after the pandemic is over? Dr. Concato, I'll turn that back over to you.
Oh, thank you. Well, hopefully my answer to the first question has helped set the stage for this, but I'll just pick up where I left off. That as we just talked about, the FDA guidance on clinical trial conduct during COVID was developed specifically to help communicate how we can adapt clinical trials in response to the pandemic and yet continue to meet FDA's expectations for patient safety, as mentioned, as well as data quality and integrity. In directly addressing the question, although this particular guidance and actually other COVID-related FDA guidances were published very quickly, but they are intended to remain in effect only for the duration of the COVID-19 public health emergency. But nonetheless, FDA and sponsors for that matter will have learned from clinical trials conducted during this pandemic, including the ability to remotely collect data and reliably capture the data necessary to support an application for a new medical product. So I'm personally very optimistic about how this can move forward. And one example that I can say on behalf of the agency is that FDA sees great promise in the use of digital technology to transform the ways that clinical trials are conducted, especially in bringing clinical trials closer to patients. And even before the COVID-19 public health emergency, FDA was actively exploring trial designs, including, for example, so-called decentralized clinical trials that move the collection of data outside of clinical research facilities where they're traditionally done to locations that are more convenient for the patient, including potentially their own home. And I can mention that FDA plans to issue what might be called quote unquote non-COVID guidance that discusses the use of digital technologies in clinical trials in the coming months. So all of this put together, these efforts can benefit clinical trials in general, as well as neuromuscular disease trials in particular. So I hope that helps to give more detailed understanding of how this process is working both now during the public health emergency and after the emergency is declared ended. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. Concato. That was a very helpful answer. One final question on the topic of clinical trials, and this comes from Nadia at, again, one of our patient advocacy group partners, I Am ALS. And Nadia, thank you again for the question. And this is an ALS specific question, and it pertains to the Helios platform trial. She asked that the ALS community is anxiously awaiting initiation of the Helios platform trial. How quickly can the FDA recommend or approve changes to the trial protocol to allow it to proceed remotely? And let me add a little bit onto that as well. In addition to the ALS platform trials, other trials may also be struggling to convert their protocol to allow for remote continuation. How is this FDA assisting these trials? Is FDA proactively working with trial sponsors to convert the trial to remote participation? Dr. Bastings, I'll turn this question over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Paul. So first, regarding the Helios platform trial, because of FDA laws protecting certain confidential information from disclosure, we are unable to provide information regarding this trial, as is generally the case for any specific trial. However, as previously discussed by Dr. Concato, we are actively working with sponsors to modify trial protocols to address the challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And in some cases, this can include modifications that allow for remote contact whenever possible.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Bastings. We really do appreciate that. Would like to move on to our next topic, which is the patient experience in clinical trials. And our first question comes from Kathy, a member of our community. And Kathy asks, are there any reasons why participating in clinical trials would expose me to contracting COVID-19? And let me ask from there, how should patients navigate the risks of COVID-19 when considering whether to enroll in a clinical trial? Dr. Baracchio, I'll turn this question over to you.
Okay. Well, your safety is certainly an important concern when you're deciding whether to enroll in a trial, or if you're already enrolled in a trial, to whether you're considering to continue in that clinical trial. Some factors patients may want to consider regarding participation in a clinical trial during the COVID-19 public health emergency include, first, whether the clinical trial requires that the investigational product be administered to participants at the trial site, or whether it allows for alternative methods for administration during the pandemic, such as at-home administration or administration by a local healthcare provider. Second of all, you should consider whether the trial requires in-person assessments, or whether alternative methods for some or all assessments are being implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic, such as phone contact, virtual visits, alternative locations for assessment, including local labs or imaging centers. And then third of all, you can consider whether your participation in the trial may interfere with measures being taken by your state or local authorities to control the virus. Any decision to participate or withdraw from the trial should be discussed with the healthcare provider that is taking care of your medical condition and the clinical trial staff. They should have a broader picture of your clinical needs and may be able to advise you about whether participation in the clinical trial is safe for you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Baracchio. That's a very helpful answer. I'd like to stay on the topic of clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this question comes from Amy, again, a member of our community, and she asks, what measures and protocols will be implemented to keep patients and all of those working and interacting with patients safe in neuromuscular disease clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic? So a related question, but a different one. And Dr. Concado, I'm actually going to turn to you for this answer.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm afraid I'm obligated to say once again that disclosure laws will limit the ability to comment on any particular trial, but nonetheless, we can say that for all trials conducted during the public health emergency, keeping patients safe is our paramount consideration. So simply put, any decision regarding the conduct of a trial during COVID-19 should first and foremost ensure the safety of participants can be maintained and document how they're doing so. The guidance that we keep on referring to has specific recommendations to help ensure patient safety when conducting clinical trials at this time. And it includes outlining considerations for sponsors on whether certain changes to their protocol may be implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic. As one example of the many recommendations, the guidance states that it may be appropriate for investigational products that are normally taken at home to be mailed directly to the participant so they don't have to come to the trial site. I alluded to that earlier, but the guidance document gives very detailed recommendations regarding how that could be done. Another detailed recommendation addresses the potential for providing administration of infusions that are normally administered in healthcare settings, again, through either home administration, ideally, or alternative infusion at a local site at least, and that could include administration by the patient's local health provider, if that provider has the appropriate experience and expertise. And this approach has been used successfully on the basis of the guidance recommendations. And then I could go further, if time allows, and just say that the guidance also speaks specifically about conducting safety assessments using remote technology, and it provides recommendations on remote capture of clinical outcome assessments. For example, performance outcomes, also another category, interview-based, clinician-reported outcomes. I don't want to get too technical. Many on the call will appreciate what we're talking about here, but it's basically the bottom line is using remote technology to enable what has been doable, but now we're doing it in the conduct of the public health emergency. And last but not least, I want to point out that the guidance mentions it's critical for trial participants themselves to be kept informed of changes to the study or to monitoring plans that could impact them, since the participants are really volunteering, obviously, and contributing their time, effort, and putting their health in the hands of the trialists. So we very much appreciate that. But with that, I'll turn it back to you, Paul, and hopefully have given a big picture view of how we're working to keep patients safe during these very difficult times.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Concato. That was an excellent answer to that question. We had additional questions on clinical trials, but we're only, in single-digit number of minutes away from when we had intended to close the webinar. So we're going to actually move forward to our next topic, and this is on regulatory approaches and regulatory response from FDA. So our first question again comes from Nadia. But we also actually received other questions, including a similar question from Gretchen, who's in the ALS community. The question reads that ALS is a 100% terminal disease. Can FDA show similar flexibility as with COVID with regard to expediting ALS treatments and facilitating expanded access programs? I'd like to add on to that question. ALS is a progressive and terminal disease, and many in the ALS community see FDA using historic regulatory flexibility to counter the pandemic and accelerate therapeutic development of COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. And they ask if FDA could do the same for ALS and perhaps in other neuromuscular diseases as well. So Dr. Basings, I would turn that question over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. FDA shares the ALS community's urgency to find new therapeutics for ALS. ALS patients deserve effective treatments just as patients with any other disease or condition do. The statutory standard for effectiveness applies to drugs and biologics for ALS, just as the standards apply for all other drugs and biologics. We have long stressed the appropriateness of exercising regulatory flexibility with respect to drugs for serious and life-threatening diseases with unmet medical needs, such as ALS, while preserving appropriate assurance of safety and effectiveness. The agency is actively engaged in working with sponsors to ensure that the ALS clinical trials are rigorously designed, including ensuring the availability of the best standard of care for all patients in ALS trials, minimizing unnecessary exposure to placebo, and encouraging transition of patients to open-label investigational treatment. We recognize that for patients with serious neurodegenerative diseases like ALS, there are few treatment options, and mechanisms for access to investigational drugs and biologics are very important. So we stand ready to help patients and healthcare professionals evaluate options for accessing investigational products, such as participating in a clinical trial or obtaining access to unapproved investigational products outside of a clinical trial through expanded access. FDA has historically approved over 98% of our requests for expanded access, and we will continue to consider all requests that we receive.
Thank you, Dr. Basings. That's a very appreciated answer. Let me actually add a follow-up to that as well, and this is a follow-up from Nadia, and she asked, what can you do to ensure that ALS trials and research are not being placed on hold due to the COVID-19 pandemic? And can FDA help advise IRBs to continue approvals and not deprioritize ALS trials? And let me add on to that. What is FDA doing to ensure ongoing research and development of new products for ALS, but other neuromuscular diseases, is not adversely affected by the COVID-19 outbreak?
Right. So FDA staff is working at full capacity to help ensure that safe and effective drugs and biologics are available to the public. And we are continuing to meet review goals, approve applications, and communicate with drug developers. Now, some staff have been relocated to the COVID-19 public health emergency. FDA may not be able to sustain its current level of timely reviews and approval for all marketing applications, but we remain committed to the timely review of new drugs and biologics for serious and life-threatening conditions, such as serious neuromuscular diseases. In addition, as discussed earlier, We have been working with sponsors to modify trial protocols as appropriate to address the challenges caused by the COVID-19 public health emergency.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bastings. Thank you. So we have a question from Jennifer, and this is actually to move on to our next topic on public meetings. Jennifer at the Coalition to Cure Calpain 3, again, one of our patient advocacy group partners. Jennifer, thanks for writing in with a question. She was asking about public meetings. As we all know, the neuromuscular disease community is one of the most active and engaged communities when it comes to FDA opportunities, not only, of course, joining a webinar like this, but also attending some of the public meetings that FDA has to offer. So Dr. Concatto, I'd like to ask you, what's the status of public meetings at FDA? When can we expect public meetings to resume at the agency?
Thank you, Paul. Certainly the agency is still accepting new meeting requests as per its usual practice, but the format of some pending meetings may have to be reevaluated depending on conditions on a almost day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Also on a case-by-case basis, advisory committee meetings are being held, but at this time they're being held virtually. We can also report that patient affairs continues to schedule patient listening sessions. So we are indeed open for business, largely via video conference and telework, but as a specific point of information, however, no firm date has been set at this time for when public meetings can be scheduled as face-to-face events at the agency. And we'll just have to update that on an ongoing basis.
Understood, absolutely. It's a very fluid situation, of course. And Dr. Concatto, you mentioned listening sessions. We had the privilege of attending a listening session that was organized by our patient advocacy partners over at Cure BCP at the beginning of May, and it was fantastic. It was a virtual listening session. Everyone did a fantastic job. So the listening sessions are indeed continuing, as you mentioned. Patient-focused drug development meetings are also continuing. In fact, MDA has a meeting scheduled for July 13th, which is a virtual patient-focused drug development, a virtual externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. I need to get all the terms in there. And this is focused on Pompe disease. So we're very excited to be holding that. And there are several other virtual PFDDs in between now and then as well. So we have 2 minutes left, and I just want to squeeze one more question in there since we have just a little bit of time left. And this is back on our topic of clinical trials. And Dr. Baracchio, I'm going to pose this to you. This question comes from Jennifer, again at Coalition to Cure Calpain 3. She asks, is there flexibility around timing of visits within clinical trials? Which outcome measures that are relevant to the neuromuscular disease population can be evaluated in virtual visits? So first part of the question is on timing, and the second part is on which outcome measures.
Yes, FDA recognizes that during the COVID-19 public health emergency, sponsors of clinical trials may need to modify protocol-specified procedures, including altering the frequency or timing of participant visits or performing some assessments remotely. However, not all assessments can be administered remotely. The sponsors and investigators of clinical trials would need to consider whether remote assessments such as phone or video are appropriate for the type of clinical data that they plan to collect. For example, assessment of certain clinical items may require a greater degree of visual input than others and may be difficult to conduct remotely. In addition, sponsors considering use of remote assessments should determine whether it would be safe and feasible for the subject to participate in the assessment at the subject's location. Finally, there may be technology-related issues that must be addressed to facilitate remote assessments. So with that, I'll turn that back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Baracchio. That's very helpful. So here we are, 15 minutes until the hour, which is when we intended on closing the webinar. So since we're out of time, first want to highlight a few of the resources that we mentioned, both from Food and Drug Administration as well as from MDA. So first, FDA.gov has a portal specifically for patients. You can see it here on the right side of your screen. That's FDA.gov/patients. And on this page, there are also links to pages specific to COVID-19. I know that I check it very often for the updates that FDA puts on there. So be sure to check that page, and we'll again include links in any follow-up that we have. MDA also has several resources for the neuromuscular disease community on COVID-19, two that I want to mention today. The first is our general COVID-19 resources page. You can find it here at the top, mda.org/COVID-19. The second is our page specific to our advocacy resources and activities in response to COVID-19. You'll see the URL right there as well. Okay, so with that, I want to have a big virtual round of applause for Dr. Shah, Dr. Bastings, Dr. Baracchio, Dr. Thacker, Dr. Concado. We're so incredibly grateful for your time today. Thank you again. And since we're 1 minute over, I'll just say I hope everyone has a great rest of your Monday. Thanks.